All righty, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to the March membership meeting of the Sierra Club. Tonight we'll have ChristianHunt with us. And the Robert Lunz group, we have over 1,300 members in Charleston, Berkeley, Dorchester, and Colleton counties. And our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. Our leadership consists of Christine von Kolnitz, who's our chair. I'm the membership and vice chair. Our treasurer position is open. If you think you might be interested in joining us and taking over this treasurer position, we would really love to have you. All you need to do is go to our Robert Lunz group page and get our contact information and let us know. Conservation chair is Ben Mack. Our outings chair and webmaster is Star Hazard. Outings leaders are Star, Bill Turner, Kim McGee, and Scott Yost. Our political position is also open, and this will be an important year coming up. If you think you might be interested in joining us for the political chair, here again, please contact us and come join us. Publicity is Laura Moses. The Lunz letter editor is Alec Cooley, and programs, Nina Fair. We also need volunteers for Charleston Ready for 100 team. We have the website there. The contact is Penny Delaney Cothran. She's the organizing rep in Columbia for Ready 100. And there's her email address and a telephone number if you think you might want to get involved in that. Star, why don't you tell us about our upcoming outings?
So the Sierra Club was born taking people outdoors, and we continue that tradition today. This weekend, this very weekend, we're going to go up to one of the most special places in South Carolina, the Santee Coastal Reserve. Now, there is overnight camping up there, and we're going to try that out on Saturday and Sunday. So we'll be spending Saturday night. If you want to come up on Saturday but not spend the night, that's okay. We'll do some of the trails that are available that have been developed over the years that we don't usually take on Saturday. And if you have a bike, bring a bike and we'll ride some of those trails on Saturday. If you want to come up on Sunday, feel free to do that, and we'll do our sort of traditional Cape Trail hike, which is about 7 to 9 miles. I forget exactly, depends a little bit about where we go. The altitude variation on these trails is 0, basically. And so they're generally firm footing, generally. So it's a pretty decent, if amazing hike. On the 19th, one of my favorite trips, we'll go off-road cycling around the Lake Moultrie passage of the Palmetto Trail. This is a trip that is about 30 miles. So you need to be in shape for that one. But it's incredibly beautiful with spring coming on and beautiful flowering trees and so on. And alligators sunning in the sun and splashing into the water and so forth. Some incredible views as well. On the 26th, Bill Turner will go down to the perennially and seasonally outstanding Bear Island Wildlife Management area, and we will ride our bicycles around the rice dikes there for another two-wheel extravaganza. So we have what happened there? Sorry. Can y'all still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know that a phone coming in, and I got it knocked me off. Sorry about that. Anyway, so while during COVID, we sort of got out of the swing of doing our outings, and we're going to go back to that. And we're suggesting that participants contribute $5 for a day trip and $10 for an overnight. This money does not go to the outings leader. It comes into our general fund, and it's a suggested amount, not a coerced amount. Anyway, there's a link for you to sign up to our individual outings to review and sign up as you will. And with that, I will take it back to Pat.
All righty. Mark your calendars for Thursday, April the 7th. We'll be doing this meeting by Zoom also. Understanding Heat Risk in Charleston. Janice Barnes is the founder, and she's with Climate Adaptation Partners with Dr. Jerry Reeves, MUSC, Dr. Kristen Dow, USC, Dr. Chip Conrad, UNC Chapel Hill. Beginning in 2020, the Charleston Medical District, Climate Partners, and the Carolina Integrated Science Assessment Team collaborated as a heat research program with a growing focus across the Southeast. So mark your calendars and plan on joining us in April. And tonight, we're proud to have Christian Hunt with us, Southeast Program Rep with Defenders of Wildlife. Christian is admitted to the North Carolina State Bar and hosts a JD from Charlotte Law, as well as a BS in Geography from UNC Chapel Hill, or Charlotte. Christian graduated from law school in 2015, where he studied environmental law with a particular emphasis on climate change in the law and the Endangered Species Act. So as we proceed with the program, put your questions in the chat and we will review these at the end. And if you would like, turn off your video in order to save energy. All right, Christian, thank you for coming and take it away.
Thanks, Pat. All right, let's see if I can get my screen up first and foremost. All right, thumbs up. Can we see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So good to see you guys. Yeah, my name's Christian Hunt. You might recognize me. It occurred to me that I think I gave a Red Wolf presentation to this group about at least 6 years or so ago at this point. It was, I believe at a church, but that presentation touched on Cape Romain, and here we are again. You know, this presentation is also going to touch on Cape Romain, among many other things. So kind of comes full circle, but really happy to be here. The horseshoe crab issue is one I've been working on for quite some time with other partner organizations such as Southern Environmental Law Center and the Coastal Conservation League, among others. And, you know, I just personally find this species to be fascinating, and to really put it in the most unsophisticated way possible. It's just a really cool animal. And it's kind of unique in the sense that I think for the most part, all of us are probably familiar with the horseshoe crab to some extent. You know, unlike red wolves or more esoteric species, I think most of us have probably encountered a horseshoe crab at some point in our lives on the East Coast. And to me, it's so intriguing partly because it's just so ancient. I mean, this species has been around for hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, and it has just somehow weathered the storm. You know, it has survived cataclysms, and it's truly just this ancient and primordial species. And, you know, unfortunately, it is facing some pretty significant challenges in South Carolina, which we're going to talk about this evening. My presentation is going to be about 30 minutes or so, just because I want to give a lot of time for Q&A, since this is such a complex and multifaceted issue. But before sort of diving into all that, I do just want to rewind a little bit and share a little about the history here. So, you know, I think when people tend to think of, you know, species of historical abundance, what often comes to mind are animals such as, you know, the bison or the passenger pigeon, and rightly so. But one that's not often discussed is the horseshoe crab. This photo was taken in Delaware Bay about a century ago, at least. And Delaware Bay, which we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, is home to the world's largest horseshoe crab population. And every year, as you guys probably know, horseshoe crabs crawl ashore to spawn in the spring and early summer months. And they're extremely vulnerable during that stage. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, people took advantage of that vulnerability, and they gathered as many crabs as they could find during that time. And they were used for a variety of purposes, but the thing that really pushed the species over the edge was the fertilizer industry. Factories were established on beaches. And as you can see, just millions of crabs were killed and ground into fertilizer paste, which was then exported. And, this was a completely indiscriminate harvest. There was no forethought given to how it might impact the species. And eventually the horseshoe crab of Delaware Bay, it did collapse. And the shorebirds that depended upon that area were either killed or relocated. Things in that area have since rebounded to some extent, but the historical abundance that once graced Delaware Bay, among other places, has not yet been realized again. And even in Delaware Bay now, horseshoe crabs are at densities that are incapable of recovering migratory shorebirds such as the red knot, which we'll get to shortly. But in recent years, it's been exciting to see the horseshoe crab undergo a sort of scientific renaissance. This species is now considered what is called a keystone species, meaning, once it's removed from an ecosystem, it has very far-reaching cascading impacts on a multitude of other animals. And we now know that a wide variety of marine animals feed on horseshoe crab eggs and larvae, such as Atlantic silversides. We now know as well that adult tiger sharks and hammerheads, among others, feed on horseshoe crabs themselves. And really one of the most interesting things that's come to light in recent decades is that the horseshoe crab is the preferred prey of the loggerhead sea turtle. We tend to, when we talk about sea turtles, focus mainly on, beach habitat and protections of that sort, and that's critically important, of course. But something that's been given less consideration is what they eat. And there was a study in Virginia not too long ago that showed that as soon as the horseshoe crab stock was fished out, loggerhead sea turtles shifted their diet downward to secondary items such as blue crab. And then after that stock was depleted, loggerhead sea turtles moved on to just consuming net entangled or discarded fish. So, this species is really just so interesting because there are so many connections and there are so many species that rely upon its well-being. And of course, the most charismatic and visible amongst them is the red knot and other migratory shorebirds. Every year, red knots leave their wintering grounds in South America, the long distance population that is, and they fly to foraging areas along the East Coast to gorge on horseshoe crab eggs. And you can see this is what those eggs look like. They're this kind of unique bluish greenish hue. And so important are these eggs that each red knot has to consume about 400,000 of them to make it to their breeding grounds in the Canadian Arctic. And the birds that don't acquire those reserves, they are less likely to successfully make it to the Arctic. They are less likely to breed So it is no exaggeration to say that the very health of the red knot population is fundamentally tied to the availability and abundance of horseshoe crab eggs. Now, it was historically thought that Delaware Bay was sort of the singularly important site for red knots. And that's, again, just because it has such a large population of horseshoe crabs. And you can see these birds undertake just a gigantic long distance migration every year. It's 9,000 miles one way. It's one of the longest distance migrations in the animal kingdom that remains intact. And, these birds utilize Delaware Bay, of course, but what we've learned in recent years is that South Carolina is of massive fundamental importance to red knots and other Arctic migratory shorebirds. I don't know if you guys can see if the Zoom box has blocked that out up in the top left corner, but not too long ago, DNR scientists, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources scientists, discovered that flocks of plus or minus 8,000 red knots have utilized South Carolina resources. And they discovered that, these red knots, when they arrive in South Carolina in April and May, they first stage on Kiowa Island, which is, a place we're all familiar with, of course. And they feed on donax, which it's a type of clam, up until the point at which horseshoe crab spawning occurs. And the moment that happens, red knots disperse to priority spawning areas to feed and gorge on horseshoe crab eggs. And DNR scientists discovered, I think it was around 4 or 5 years ago, that 2/3 of the red knots that stop in South Carolina are actually bypassing Delaware Bay altogether on the way to their Arctic breeding grounds. So it is no exaggeration to say that South Carolina is fundamentally important to long-term recovery efforts for the Rufa red knot, which is a threatened species now, listed under the Endangered Species Act. Now, that of course brings us to where we're at today and the challenges facing the horseshoe crab of South Carolina. This is kind of a unique setting in that, unlike Delaware Bay, where there are a host of uses for horseshoe crabs, including bait, South Carolina only has the biomedical industry. And that's because representatives from Charles River Labs decades ago actually drafted legislation that prohibited the use of horseshoe crabs for anything but the biomedical harvest. So it created this sort of monopoly for this industry in effect. And the process every year is that the state of South Carolina, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, issues hand harvest permits to state fishermen. It's essentially a blank check for these people to harvest horseshoe crabs on behalf of Charles River, who pays them. And they then gather all the crabs they can from spawning beaches, typically before they have a chance to spawn. They load them up in boats. They then transport them in trucks to bleeding facilities, such as the one pictured here, where horseshoe crabs are live bled for their blue blood, as you can see there. That is produced into a product called LAL, which is essentially just used to ensure that medical devices and instruments are free of bacterial contaminants. After this process concludes, crabs are then trucked back to the general area from which they were harvested and released into the ocean. So as you guys can imagine, this is stressful for horseshoe crabs. This is a marine animal. It is not adapted to surviving outside of the marine environment for long durations. And studies have shown that, the bleeding process disorients crabs upon release. It has been seen that horseshoe crabs, in many cases, just stop responding to tidal rhythms post-bleeding. It reduces spawning success. Because 50% of their blood is removed, it impairs immunity. And this host of factors combined creates conditions for very deleterious long-term impacts on the reproductive success of the horseshoe crab. And, most fundamentally is the challenge that these animals are not given a chance to spawn during their most sensitive life stage. They come ashore in the spring to propagate their species, but they are not being given a chance to do so in South Carolina. Almost all crabs are intercepted before they reach spawning beaches. And, as you can imagine, that is impacting population dynamics and the long-term population structure of this important species. And the final bullet point, it says ultimately unnecessary because, at this point, this is now an antiquated practice. There is now a synthetic alternative on the market called recombinant factor C, and it's already been adopted. Eli Lilly, for instance, is a major pharmaceutical player. They've transitioned about 90% of their testing to RFC testing. RFC is again short for recombinant factor C, the synthetic. Recently, the US government also purchased 100,000 doses of COVID vaccines tested with RFC, and it has been approved for widespread blanket use in Europe. So the times are changing. There will be a day in which horseshoe crabs are not bled, I hope. It's just a matter of how fast we can get there. And Charles River Laboratories is the only bleeder in South Carolina. And for various reasons, which we'll discuss in the Q&A, I'm sure, they have been the most reluctant to make this transition. And indeed, they have fought it every step of the way. And at this time, they're doubling down on the practice of harvesting horseshoe crabs in South Carolina. So that brings me to Cape Romain. Me and my colleagues have been working on horseshoe crab issues for some time now, and it is essentially a black box in South Carolina. Charles River and the state do not release any data about where they harvest, how many they harvest, how many they kill, or what population and harvest trends look like over the course of decades. So it's been really hard to just figure out how this industry operates and to pull back the curtain. But slowly, we have gathered the puzzle pieces and we've developed a pretty comprehensive picture of what operations look like. And for us, it began with Cape Romain National Wildlife Refuge, which I'm sure you guys, you don't need any introduction to this magical place. As far as shorebird habitats go, there are very few like it anywhere in North America. It supports hundreds of thousands of birds, and it's pretty large. It's 60,000 plus acres, and there are several places in Cape Romain that are just of disproportionate importance. They're not explicitly listed here, but you can see where my cursor is hovering. One is White Banks, which is in that vicinity. Another is Marsh Island in this vicinity. And the other is Bulls Island. Now, Marsh Island right here is one of the single most important habitats anywhere on the East Coast. It's not a huge habitat by any stretch of the imagination, but it is very nearly unrivaled in terms of its abundance and diversity of species. And, you know, I've been there and it's just buzzing with wildlife. This picture was taken on Marsh Island. Marsh Island actually has, over the past 4 or 5 decades, had 18 species of nesting seabird, shorebird, and wading birds. It has the largest assemblage of red knots to use the refuge. It has the largest assemblage of roosting and foraging marbled godwits in all of South Carolina. And it's actually the only place to have documented successful brown pelican nesting every year since recording began. And one of the main reasons that this place is so attractive to red knots and other migratory shorebirds, or one of the reasons it used to be so attractive, was because of its horseshoe crab abundance. This photo was taken on Marsh years ago. And, you know, it used to be one of the largest spawning aggregations in Cape Romain. Unfortunately, we learned through our investigations that Marsh Island was annually plundered for many years. Oh, I think we got somebody not on mute. Thank you. Yeah, so Marsh Island is hugely important, but and for that reason, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has closed it to all human entry from February to September every year, down to low tide, to protect these species. But unfortunately, we learned that one harvester and his crew operated on Marsh Island, removing thousands of horseshoe crabs for at least a decade, and probably much longer. And we now know that Marsh Island does not support anywhere near the horseshoe crab abundance it used to, or the abundance of red knots. And you can see they're disturbing shorebirds right here. You can see the island closed sign. And eventually we learned that around 25,000 horseshoe crabs were taken every year from Cape Romain National Wildlife Refuge. And this practice unfortunately lasted decades. And you know, once we did develop a picture of what was happening, defenders in the Southern Environmental Law Center litigated over harvesting in Cape Romain. And after the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm happy to say, announced this year that it was going to regulate the harvest in accordance with federal regulations, we voluntarily dismissed our suit, and we're optimistic that moving forward, this is going to end the threat of continued harvesting in this very, very special and irreplaceable place. But as you can see here, Cape Romain is just one slice of the pie. It represents about the northern end of Charles River's harvesting range. But horseshoe crabs are harvested on many other priceless habitats in South Carolina, such as DeVoe Bank Seabird Sanctuary, Turtle Island Wildlife Management Area, Tybee National Wildlife Refuge, and plenty of places in between. And they take, we believe, around 150,000 crabs per year. They at least, they did when before the numbers collapsed, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, through our investigations, we also came to learn of another pretty closely held manner of operation, and that's the use of detaining crabs in holding ponds. Holding ponds are essentially man-made earthen pits, as you can see here. And essentially what happens is harvesters go out into the habitats such as Cape Romain, Turtle Island, DeVoe Bank. They gather up horseshoe crabs and they bring them to pits such as these to store. And crabs are held for weeks and months at a time in these pits until Charles River is ready to bleed them. And, they can be 50 acres, they can be a variety of sizes, but we know that tens of thousands of crabs can be held in them at any given time. And eventually we uncovered through internal correspondences that 75% of all harvested crabs in South Carolina are detained in these ponds, and they're unsanitary, they're crowded conditions, and thousands of crabs are killed in the process. And perhaps most importantly, these crabs are not spawning on beaches when they're held in pits like this for the duration of the summer. And that deprives shorebirds of needed sustenance. So defenders, the Coastal Conservation League, and the Southern Environmental Law Center, again, have teamed up to address this issue through litigation. We're currently in the process of suing Charles River and SCDNR for their violations of the Endangered Species Act and the impact that this is having on the red knot. And, holding ponds are only utilized in South Carolina. It is, we would argue, just a plainly unsustainable practice that is going to have devastating long-term consequences for horseshoe crabs if it continues as is. So if you guys have been following this issue, you'll know that there's been a lot of back and forth about what the health of the population actually looks like in South Carolina. And one thing that Charles River and SCDNR to some extent point to in support of the horseshoe crab being in good health purportedly is a stock assessment that was developed recently by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, the ASMFC. This was a regional assessment that attempted to just quantify what trends in horseshoe crab populations look like. And just moving this over. And the surveys that were used to inform these population estimates were undertaken by the state of South Carolina. Historically, the ASMFC has discounted these surveys for their biases, for the lack of data, and potential inaccuracies. According to SCDNR internal correspondences, they've also admitted that these are fundamentally unreliable surveys. But they were nonetheless used to develop this regional estimate. But because there was so little data, we don't even know what the male to female ratio looks like in South Carolina. We don't know what the health of localized populations look like, at least according to that data. And so the ASMFC, what they did was they took this inadequate data that's been produced by South Carolina, and they lumped it together with data from Georgia, where there is no harvest in a healthy population. And they pointed to that regional estimate and said that things look okay in the Southeast. But again, that regional estimate was regional in nature. It didn't speak to anything specific in South Carolina necessarily. And this contrasts with what we're hearing from agency staff, scientists, birders, and people on the ground who've been tagging horseshoe crabs for decades, who are all unanimously saying that the horseshoe crab is in collapse right now in South Carolina. We know that Cape Romain has largely been depleted of horseshoe crabs. We know Turtle Island Wildlife Management Area has too. Tybee National Wildlife Refuge. Former staff with SCDNR reported in public reporting recently that where there used to be hundreds, you're lucky to see few, if any, horseshoe crabs. And we've corresponded with boatmen throughout the range in South Carolina who've been on the water every week for decades, and horseshoe crabs have largely disappeared, according to them. So we believe this population is in free fall right now, and we are at a flashpoint for horseshoe crab and red knot recovery efforts. And according to Georgia DNR biologists, biologists even who've been monitoring what's happening in South Carolina, they say that we might be witnessing a collapse before our eyes. And, this supposition is supported by Charles River's latest efforts. The name of this place is, I think, blocked out by the Zoom bar, but this is the Ace Basin National Estuarine Research Reserve. You guys are probably familiar with the general area, but this is really one of the last control sites in South Carolina that has gone unharvested. And Charles River, we know, is trying to open it up. And that's because otter, ash, beet, warren, and big islands have been off limits to horseshoe crab harvesting for decades, and they have potentially healthy populations remaining. Morgan Island is also off limits, but we know that Charles River has been meeting with the governor's office. They've been meeting with SCDNR's leadership about this very place and opening it up. And according to investigative reporting, Charles River actually made an unprecedented cash offer of $500,000 to the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources to open up this place and other areas under the state's jurisdiction. We don't know as of yet whether SCDNR and the state have accepted that offer. But again, the fact that Charles River is trying to gain entry to this last stronghold supports the idea that horseshoe crabs are in free fall in South Carolina, and that things are not looking good for this species. And in order to really understand the larger context here, you have to understand that Charles River and SCDNR are very financially entangled and have been for quite some time. Among other things, Charles River leases from SCDNR Morgan Island right here to the tune of millions of dollars. And those dollars support the Marine Resources Division's operating budget, which oversees horseshoe crab harvesting. So there is a very powerful incentive to allow unencumbered harvesting on the scale that we're seeing today in South Carolina because of this relationship between industry and government. And the state of play today is such that right now the biomedical industry is effectively unregulated. I think for most species, it's understood these days that they're managed in a time and place manner. They're managed according to quotas and numbers. None of that applies to the horseshoe crab harvest. There is no harvest limit at all in South Carolina. Harvesters can take and gather as many crabs as they want throughout the spawning season. There are no limits on the time that crabs can be held out of water, which again has a very negative impact on the health of horseshoe crabs. We've seen through documentation that crabs are stacked to capacity in uncovered boats. So they're just dumped into boats, which again impacts health. Harvesters handle them by the telson, which is their tail-like appendage, in a manner that is known to harm crabs. They're also transported in unrefrigerated trailers and exposed to the sun on the way to bleeding facilities. That's another thing that impacts their health. And, all of this could result in a mortality rate that's at least 30% in South Carolina. And, virtually all priority red knot foraging areas from Cape Romain down to Turtle Island are harvested. So, this industry is uniquely unencumbered in almost every way. That's not to say there aren't some basic things that SCDNR could implement to put things on the right track. First and foremost is simply imposing some time, place, and manner restrictions. As I just mentioned, horseshoe crabs are harvested with impunity from virtually everywhere in South Carolina. We would argue that there needs to be some closures around the new and full moons during spawning to allow horseshoe crabs to spawn. All priority red knot foraging areas should be closed to human entry during those critical migration months. We'd also argue that this hand harvest permit that is issued to fishermen every year needs to be revised. This is something that we have been advocating for unsuccessfully for years now, because this harvest permit is essentially a blank check. It doesn't list really any explicit restrictions. It only lists one place as explicitly off limits, and that's the Ace Basin, those islands I told you about earlier. And for fishermen, the practical effect is that no areas are off limits. They have to look it up themselves on a case-by-case basis, which areas are closed and which are open. So it's resulted in sort of a Wild West mentality out on the water in South Carolina. We'd also contend that South Carolina needs to develop a horseshoe crab specific survey. As I mentioned earlier, the existing surveying methods in South Carolina are fundamentally flawed. This is something the state, this is something the ASMFC have both recognized in the past. And in order to really have a firm grasp on numbers, they need to develop something solely focused on horseshoe crabs. And there's a model for that already. It's being implemented in Delaware Bay. It's the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, which is focused just on horseshoe crabs. And that model can be replicated in South Carolina. We also argue that the use of holding ponds just plainly needs to be prohibited. I mean, it's a wildly unsustainable practice. And finally, the state, South Carolina, the Department of Natural Resources in particular, needs to create some distance between it and industry. Charles River is a private operator and SCDNR is a public wildlife agency, but those lines have been dramatically blurred. And, I think those financial entanglements between these two have at least contributed to some extent to the utter lack of regulation and oversight that we've witnessed in South Carolina over the years. So, that wraps up just my basic overview. But, I do hope it was helpful and insightful, and I want to open it up to Q&A because this is such a complex issue. But the long and short of it is that, now's the time for the horseshoe crab and red knot in South Carolina. And if we're going to really start moving things forward in a major way, we can benefit from your guys' support and engagement on this issue. So thank you for inviting me today, and I'll hand it back to the moderators now.
All righty, Christian, that was amazing. We do have some questions here in our chat. So let me see if I can bring these up. Okay, I seem to be a little frozen up here. Let's see.
Pat, you want me to read the questions?
Yeah, because my computer seems to be frozen. Yeah, if you don't mind, take it over, please.
Okay. Star made a comment about hemocyanin. So that was an informative comment about copper and LAL. David Quick says he sees dead horseshoe crabs on Sullivan's Island almost every time he goes to the beach. That can't be normal. Any comment about that, Christian?
Yeah, so you guys might recall years ago, there were reports on Hilton Head and in Cape Romain about just piles of dead crabs washing up. Now, crabs do die as a result during the spawning process and, isolated patches here and there, but it's very unnatural to see large aggregations of dead crabs. And we know that those crabs died as a result of poor handling. Essentially, when harvesters return them to the water, we've seen them throwing crabs by the telson after this really injurious bleeding process. And as I mentioned, this has a lot of stress on horseshoe crabs. And if they're not handled in a very delicate and intentional manner, crabs die. So, it was a problem in Hilton Head for a while. It was a problem on the boat landing to Cape Romain for a while. I believe most harvesters have moved further offshore to prevent these visible mortality events, but that could certainly be what you've been seeing.
Okay, thank you. Terry Lynn says it's much cheaper to make limulus lysate than the recombinant test. That's more profit for Charles River. Star says the cost will fall. Jane Settle is asking about dissolved oxygen in the ponds. Do you want to address either one of those?
Yeah, I'll start with the price. So it's arguable. Right now, Charles River appears to be doubling down on its reliance of cartridge technology in South Carolina, which uses LAL, but it reduces the amount they need. So there's a financial incentive for them to continue harvesting as they are, because they're purportedly selling this cartridge for much, much higher than they used to just sell standard LAL. But then again, if the horseshoe crab population is collapsing before our eyes, and Charles River is scrambling to open up other areas before it results in commercial extirpation, then why wouldn't they, start making this shift? And, they contend that they are in the media, but they're certainly not moving fast, and they're certainly obstructing the regulatory process here.
Okay, thank you. Star says, do the crabs in the holding ponds get returned to the wild after bleeding?
For those that survive, yes. But again, a lot of them don't survive. And even if they are alive upon release, there's no guarantee at all that they survive after being dumped back into the marine environment after that process.
And Sean asks, we're the only state to pond the crab out of how many states or locations?
Biomedical bleeding occurs essentially from North Carolina up to Delaware Bay, or South Carolina up to Delaware Bay. So there's several manufacturers, but yeah, South Carolina is undoubtedly the only one to allow that practice.
And Star says there a limit to the amount of blood that can be extracted, and how much money do they get for it?
Generally, no. Usually 50% of the blood is drained. Charles River contends that they don't overbleed crabs, but again, that's not monitored at all. And essentially they're just bled until it stops.
Jane asks, how would horseshoe crabs be tagged given their total exoskeleton molt?
Well, tagging has proven pretty unsuccessful. I can't specifically answer your question, but we know that most tagged crabs are not recaptured on a general large scale. I mean, some are, of course, but tagging has proven to be a pretty unreliable process for horseshoe crabs.
Okay. And Star was wondering, how often do they molt per year?
I'm actually not sure of that, and I don't want to give you a guess on that. I could certainly get back to you.
Okay, actually, Jane just responded to that right below it. Based on the growth rate, more often when younger. Thank you, Jane. Okay, Jane says, are folks aware of how much Charles River is loading up social media? I'm aware of it. They're all over Facebook with ads stating that they are protecting horseshoe crabs in South Carolina. Yeah, they're out there. Paul says most of the horseshoe crabs that I've seen in Isle of Palms are dead or lethargic. That's depressing. Eve says, what can we do to help in the effort to save the crabs?
Yeah, thanks, Eve. First and foremost, we need to pressure SCDNR. SCDNR is the agency that issues permits to these fishermen on an annual basis. SCDNR has the regulatory authority to close certain areas. They have the regulatory authority to make the hand harvest permit more robust. They have the authority to create distance between them and Charles River, but they've chosen not to do so. And they have encouraged the phenomenal rate of harvesting that we're seeing in South Carolina today at the expense of migratory shorebirds. So if you want to do something, please encourage SCDNR's leadership to do something themselves, because for all intents and purposes, they've really not done anything to regulate this industry since harvesting began in the early 90s.
Wow. Okay, that's good to know. Contact DNR. And David says, does Charles River manufacture anything else? Or do they have all their investment in horseshoe crab? And he also mentioned the Facebook ads. Well,
Yeah, Charles River is a gigantic company. I think it's like a $16 billion company. So they've got their eggs in a lot of baskets. In Charleston, though, the main operation is around LAL.
And then Terry Lynn had answered that Charles River is supplier of special strains of mice for research. Christian, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can see if anybody else wants to unmute and ask any questions directly or make any comments, or if you have anything else to tell us. Pat's back on. That is a very sobering and informative talk. I mean, I knew that was going on. I can't stand to look at them lined up on those machines. It just looks awful. But this tonight was certainly helpful to me to learn more about it. And I feel like I have a stronger position to contact DNR and say something. So thank you for letting us know all this information.
Looks like Eve has her hand up.
I did. I'm trying to use the Zoom protocol. Thank you very much. That was a really illuminating presentation. I did not realize that they had been initially harvested for fertilizer. I knew that they had been used as bait, like chum for fishing. But anyway, is there any pressure now being put on SCDNR to?
I think, in terms of pressure, there's been a lot of pressure with investigative reporting, uncovering, the nature of operations. I don't know if you guys have been following that coverage in the state, but there's been that coupled with litigation. So I think, there's certainly a budding movement in play right now. But, we're going to keep building on it, and we hope you guys will join us moving forward, because we've still got a really long ways to go until we recreate the conditions that are going to be suitable for recovering red knots in South Carolina and the horseshoe crab again.
Well, Christian, please make sure that you stay in touch with us, and any guidance you can give us as to how we can possibly help. Please make sure you pass this on to us, because I knew it was a bad situation, but it's a lot more disturbing than what I had originally thought. And I find it very disturbing due to the fact that there is a synthetic that's available that can do the same thing as the blood of these crabs. And it needs to be shut down, in my opinion. So please stay in touch with us and let us know whatever there is that we can do. And David Quick's got a good question here. Let me see if I can get it without my computer freezing up on me.
Meanwhile,
Okay.
Jane Settle.
Jane has her hand up. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, just one thought based on the internal personnel events within DNR over the last year. Best directing letters to Robert Boyles, the director of the whole agency, rather than to the Marine Resources Division, which would have purview over the species.
Thanks. That's good to know. Robert Will. Okay.
Boyles with an S,
Yeah,
Oh,
Boyles.
right?
okay. Thank you. And Sean says, is there more hope than recent past for shutting down this practice? Christian, I know you talked about trying to change some of the rules and the laws. What's the word?
Yeah, I mean, we're starting from ground zero here. So, you know, the first steps are implementing some of the things that I listed there and creating a semblance of balance between industry and conservation. But of course, the longer term goal here is to get Charles River to stop bleeding and to adopt the synthetic. And, you know, I hope we see that day sooner than later. And I think, you know, the pace at which we realize that will ultimately depend on how much pressure the people of South Carolina put on them. And, you know, I think that pressure is building. I think it's become clear that, you know, the state is not really going to continue to tolerate the status quo. So, you know, it's about steps, it's incremental, but absolutely the goal is to get them to a point where, you know, this antiquated, inhumane practice is essentially rendered obsolete.
And then, yes, okay, so Star posted the Boyle's contact info, and then David Quick was asking, is there a campaign or an email list that we can join or to?
There's not an email list to add folks to right now. It's a pretty good idea though. But yeah, I'll send you guys our information and things that come to light. And if you guys could just share them with your membership, that'd be a good first step.
Absolutely.
Well, that'll be good because we can put any information that you forward us, we can put that in our monthly newsletter. And, you know, we've got 1,300 and more members. So yeah, send us whatever you can. We'll put it in our newsletter and we'll be reaching out to as many people as we possibly can.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much.
All right, Christian, thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
See
All
everybody
right,
next
everybody.
month.
Well, thank you for coming and have a good evening. Bye-bye now.